About the difficulties in covering the conflict and the issues it raises when you're dealing with a hugely polarised debate and one in which civilians are being killed on both sides. Well, in Jerusalem is Dr. Einat Wilf, who's a senior fellow of the Jewish People's Policy Institute, who thinks that Hamas controls media coverage coming out of Gaza. In central London, Dr. Azam Tamimi is chairman of Arabic language TV channel Al Hiwa, who believes that media organisations will inevitably take sides. And Jonathan Paris is a former Middle East fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, who believes it's very hard for any of us to gain a fully impartial view. So welcome to all of you. Dr. Einat Wilf, to you there in Jerusalem, first of all, do you feel that across the world a fair and balanced picture is being portrayed, is being reported as to what's happening?
You have the occasional fair and balanced picture, but I wouldn't say that overall this is the case. And the reason is quite simple, that the images that emerge from Gaza are heavily controlled by Hamas. It is always the case when reporters report from totalitarian societies, and Gaza under Hamas is a totalitarian society. Their ability to project the truth, to tell the truth, is severely limited. Now that some journalists are emerging from Gaza, we actually have evidence of that. We have journalists talking about the fact that they were not able to send images, for example, of Hamas militants. I mean, you would think that there is nobody fighting on Gaza, simply families. But there are, and those are mostly those who were killed, Hamas militants who are fighting against Israeli soldiers, and they are making clear to journalists that if they dare point the camera at them, their life is at stake. So one would think that there's no war going on, but it is a war, and there are Hamas militants on the other side, but the media doesn't show it. There's no one firing rockets. How did more than 3,000 rockets get to Israel? Who fired them? Now we have journalists beginning to tell the story of Hamas firing rockets from within heavily populated areas.
A lot of journalists would say they've tried all along to portray... Sorry to interrupt you. A lot of journalists would say they've tried all along to portray just that, to portray rockets being fired from inside Gaza. The truth is that it's militants don't advertise themselves and they walk around Gaza. It's hard to know who they are.
That's actually not the case. We now have evidence from journalists who say that next to them or in the hospitals, they saw militants, but one of them even tried to point a camera and said that basically his life was threatened. So it was clear to the journalists what they can picture and what they cannot picture. We have now accounts of journalists saying that about 10 to 20% of Hamas rockets fell within Gaza and killing Gazan civilians. Hamas militants were sure to get to the point, quickly remove the debris, and then tell a story that this is Israel attacking those civilians.
Okay, Dr.
All of these things, you can now find them. They are coming out now, but for about a month, we did not hear those stories.
So, Dr. Azam Tamimi, the Israelis are saying that Hamas is controlling the media. Do you think that's fair?
Well, what we have just heard is clearly war propaganda, and the media is as important a battlefield in war, especially nowadays with its instant effect, as the actual fighting itself. Of course, the Israelis would want to use the media in order to justify the atrocities they've been committing inside Gaza, such as claiming that Hamas and other resistance factions use civilians as shields, as claiming that rockets are being fired from hospitals or schools, and as a result they are justified in bombing these places, even UN shelters that the UN invited people to take shelter in. Naturally, as a party to the conflict, Israel would like to send that image, but I think it's increasingly difficult to be fool. It is increasingly difficult to fool the public around the world, because with the existence of satellite TV, of the social media, the images come out. And by the way, Hamas was properly democratically elected by the Palestinian people, and therefore its categorization, as we heard, is totally false and untrue.
Jonathan Paris, let's bring you in. Both sides then accusing the other of propaganda. Is it inevitable in a conflict like this that you're going to get each side making accusations like that?
Yes, I think so. I think what you heard from Mr. Tamimi is a good example. I mean, look, yes, for instance, Hamas was democratically elected. Yeah, they won a plurality of the vote, but then they executed a coup and they threw out by force the Palestinian Authority. And I believe, just on the political point, the only way we're going to have a peace there is for the Palestinian Authority to come back and start to take charge of a rehabilitation and reconstruction of Gaza. But yes, this is a very difficult situation where both sides have so much at stake. And I have to say that for the last 30 days, I think the Hamas view was shown more favorably because they focused on the babies, these telegenic pictures of babies, and not on the militants.
Well, yes, but how people do get their news from various sources these days, don't they? And most aspects of the conflict is covered somewhere. Isn't a modern audience quite intelligent about sifting out the truth?
No, they aren't. You show the 7-year-old girl, Maha, and you are affected by it emotionally. I think over time, though, there is a balance. You heard Hillary Clinton yesterday give an interview in which she talked about what Mr. Tamimi says is false, about the fact that there is now evidence that rockets were fired from schools and mosques and UN buildings, so that it's coming out with evidence, and I think it will balance the story. But what I worry about is the radicalizing of Muslims in Britain as a result of seeing basically Mr. Tamimi's viewpoint.
Okay, well, let's go back to Mr. Tamimi then. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm really astonished. I was told that Mr. Paris is like sort of a neutral position between me and your guest from Israel. But this is turning to be the exact opposite. But anyway, I would like to remind him, and if he needs to learn more about it, I would advise him to read my book on Hamas, that what happened in June 2007 was not a coup by Hamas. There was already a coup being planned by the Americans under General Dayton. Hamas was in power. Hamas was the elected government, and it foiled that attempt. So he has his facts even upside down. It is just regrettable that such fallacy is marketed in the media in this way.
Okay, a quick word back from you, Jonathan Paris.
Well, I respect Mr. Tamimi as a scholar. I don't agree with him. I don't think Mr. Dayton was launching a coup. But let's say he's right. I think what I'm trying to say is that in a war like this, so much is at stake for Hamas and for the Israelis to get their view across that there is going to be a lot of propaganda. And I think Israelis do show some propaganda, too. I read a report, for instance, this morning that said that Hamas was executing those people who were building the tunnels. Those are Palestinians who were building the tunnels. They were executing them for fear that these tunnel diggers would betray the tunnel locations to Israelis as collaborators. Now, that may be true, but it does sound a little bit like propaganda coming from the IDF. So Mr. Tamimi has a point. I do want to stress that I'm not trying to just take the other side here, but it's very difficult to get at the truth, and I think you have to give it time. Unfortunately, people's impressions are formed at the outset during the war. Hopefully now, as things calm down, hopefully the ceasefire will go on for a few days, maybe longer. We'll have a chance to more objectively look at both sides. And both sides have been in the propaganda game, Mr. Tamimi, not just your side. I think the Israeli side is also guilty there, too.
Okay, well, we must leave it there, but all three of you, we really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us.